Good evening, everyone. My name is Tani Schwartz-Herman. I work in JTS's Department of Community Engagement. I am so pleased to welcome you to the 8th Annual JTS Evening of Learning with the Greater Washington Jewish Community. We are disappointed not to be able to gather in person this year, but we're glad that we have the technology in place to be able to pivot to a virtual program. We also know that this means that more people are able to participate in our program, and we really appreciate your understanding of the change on short notice. And we really hope to be able to gather in person again soon. I want to thank our partners in Greater Washington. We say every year that this is such a terrific community, and we really appreciate our partnership with all the synagogues and organizations in Greater Washington. And we've just shared in the chat a list of all of our partners. We especially want to thank Kol Shalom, who was supposed to host this year's program. Even though we wound up switching to a virtual program, a lot of time had already been spent in planning an in-person program at Kol Shalom. I want to especially thank Samantha Greenwald, Sally Heckelman, and Elisa Messian at Kol Shalom for all of their work. And they're with us they'll be hosting some of the study sessions this evening as well. And thank you to Rabbi Gil Steinloff, who will offer some words of welcome shortly. Rabbi Julia Andelman, our Director of Community Engagement, was slated to welcome you on behalf of JTS and open this evening's program. She is recovering from COVID and is unfortunately unable to speak tonight due to a sore throat, but she is here with us on Zoom. Our theme for this evening is Expanding the Canon, Transforming Judaism in the 21st Century. Jewish learning has long focused on texts written and compiled by an elite group of ancient rabbis and their successors. Tonight, we're going to be asking what it would mean to radically expand our canon, incorporating the voices of women, Jews of color, people with disabilities, and other historically marginalized groups. Our scholars will offer new lenses through which to read ancient texts and also introduce entirely new voices into the conversation. Together, we'll explore how diversifying our canonical text can help us create a more inclusive Jewish community and even change our understanding of Judaism itself. Our faculty tonight include not only scholars currently at JTS, but other master teachers connected to JTS in various ways. Rabbi Eliezer Diamond is a member of the JTS faculty. Dr. Ora Horn-Prauser did her doctorate at JTS and now leads the Academy for Jewish Religion in New York. Dr. Michal Rauscher, a graduate of JTS's List College, is now a professor at Rutgers University. And Heather Miller, a skilled educator in race consciousness, comes to us from USCJ, our sister conservative movement organization, where she serves as a board member. We'll begin with the keynote with Professor Shuly Rubin Schwartz, Chancellor of JTS. As a scholar, Chancellor Schwartz brings to light previously overlooked contributions of women to Jewish life and culture over the centuries and continually expands our understanding of American Judaism, which she will be discussing in her keynote. Following that, we will have the opportunity to choose from among 4 breakout study sessions led by our outstanding scholars, Rabbi Eliezer Diamond, Dr. Michal Rauscher, Dr. Ora Horn-Prauser, and Heather Miller. We want to acknowledge that there are other marginalized groups within our community that are not represented in these sessions. We hope that these sessions can serve as models of how we can think more broadly about the notion of expanding the canon and creating more inclusive Jewish communities. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rabbi Steinloff from Kol Shalom to offer some welcome remarks on behalf of Kol Shalom and the Greater Washington community.
Thank you, Tani. It is indeed a privilege and an honor for me to welcome everyone to this event. Only sad that I am not able to be standing in front of you at Kol Shalom itself, welcoming you in person. We all share that sadness about the realities of the COVID that is still raging in our world right now. We are honored, though, to the extent that Kol Shalom was the first synagogue in the Greater Washington area where there was the first JTS Evening of Learning, and we were very happy to welcome the great scholars of the seminary back to us. What I just want to say is, I speak for myself and for other graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary when I say that it was an extraordinary experience for me to be at the seminary. It was a place where regularly we felt that we were on the cutting edge of some of the most important conversations in American Judaism and in Judaism around the world. And it is an incredible blessing that JTS opens its doors, metaphorically as it were, for everyone now, to usher all of us into those very profound and transformative conversations. And I can't think of a better series of subjects than the ones that we are treating tonight in expanding the canon. So I just want to express on behalf of Kol Shalom, on behalf of my colleagues at the other participating synagogues in the greater Washington area, deep gratitude to the seminary for hosting this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Steinloff. Pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Shuly Rubin Schwartz is the 8th Chancellor of JTS and the Irving Lerman Research Professor of American Jewish History. Dr. Schwartz has played a central role in shaping and strengthening JTS's academic programs while teaching and mentoring countless students, having served as the Dean of the Albert A. List College of Jewish Studies, Dean of the Gershon Ketz Graduate School, as well as Provost of JTS. Chancellor Schwartz was one of the first women on the JTS faculty and played an instrumental role in introducing Jewish gender studies into the curriculum. Among her publications is the award-winning book, The Rabbi's Wife, a penetrating examination of the role of rabbis' wives in the development of American Jewish life. Please note that Chancellor Schwartz actually pre-recorded her keynote for us a few days ago when this evening program was still going to be happening in person, and it became clear that she shouldn't travel just before her inauguration as Chancellor this coming week due to the recent uptick in COVID cases. So you'll hear a reference to that at the beginning of her remarks.
Good evening. How I wish I could be with all of you face to face at Kol Shalom. I'm sad that COVID precautions prevent me from being there. But I'm inspired that this evening of learning brings together so many different synagogue communities, and I'm grateful for the technology that enables me to offer a keynote that I hope will set the stage for what I know will be 4 rich and insightful sessions by my admired colleagues. When I began college, most of the books, fiction and nonfiction, plays, poems, memoirs, and essays were written by, as we came to refer to them, dead white men. Many were considered classics, worthy of being included in the canon of Western culture because of their literary significance and influence on subsequent generations. I felt fortunate to attend a liberal arts college where faculty challenged me to read, analyze, and critique many of these great books. By the time I graduated, the landscape had changed considerably. Students in colleges and universities all over the country began questioning the limitations of this model. Were there no women's works that merited inclusion in the canon? My own consciousness had been raised, not only by shifting societal views, but also because I was fortunate to attend a women's college. When I went on to graduate school, studying Jewish history, I was elated each time I encountered the voices of women. The discovery of new sources, new questions, and new interpretations began to animate my thoughts, research, and writing. Happily, I entered the field as a scholar and teacher just as Jewish women's studies emerged as a field. More senior colleagues a few years ahead of me, such as Paula Hyman, Zichrona Livracha, Deborah Dash-Moore, and Judith Hauptman, paved the way. Thanks to them and the many others whom they trained, we know so much more about Jewish women over the ages. These colleagues shared my eagerness to unearth previously unknown sources, an impulse that over time naturally led to a desire to expand the canon to include the voices of women. What would it look like to expand the canon? How would we go about it? What criteria should we use to figure out what to include in this expanded canon? And how would expanding the canon change our understanding of Judaism, Jewish history, thought, and culture? These questions naturally led to questions about whether we could or should excise sources from the canon, either to make room for new additions or because, given contemporary sensibilities, they no longer merited inclusion. At JTS, these questions had immediate ramifications for our classes. In my early years of teaching, one of the popular introductory classes was called Classics of the Jewish Tradition, a class that I loved teaching in my early years on the faculty. Designing the syllabus for that course meant selecting the classics of the Jewish canon. To add a new source inevitably meant cutting something from the syllabus. In order to make those decisions, we kept coming back to these questions of what makes up the canon and how it could or should evolve. To figure this out, let's begin with the first sentence of the description for tonight's program. Jewish learning has long focused on texts by an elite group of ancient rabbis. In other words, classical Jewish learning equals rabbinics, and that study itself builds upon the Hebrew Bible, our quintessential canonical text, which we might say is divinely inspired, perhaps, but written or compiled by men who decided what would be in or out of the Bible. The first level of canonization. Most of extant medieval Jewish literature was also written by men. So even if we had wanted 100 years ago to expand the canon to include women's texts, let alone writing by other marginalized groups, we would first have had to expand the notion of canon, identify other sources to include, and then we would have had to accept the view that even modern Jews can create works worthy of inclusion in the Jewish canon. The groundwork for our contemporary efforts to expand the canon dates to the late 18th and 19th centuries. First, Jews during the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, brought the outlook of Enlightenment thinking to Judaism. Haskalah thinkers produced astounding works of philosophy, poetry, memoirs, and thought. A few decades later, pioneering scholars of what became known as Wissenschaft des Judentums, the scientific study of Judaism, applied academic methods of critical thinking and research to Jewish studies. They opened our eyes to what the Jewish canon could encompass by painstakingly finding and identifying sources that had been lost to history. For example, Leopold Zuntz produced surveys of liturgical poetry, sermons, and synagogal rites, bringing to light so much that had been lost. Or Israel Davidson, a JTS faculty member a century ago, who compiled Otsar HaShira v'HaPiyut, a thesaurus of medieval Hebrew poetry. This kind of spadework brought to light thousands of gorgeous, canon-worthy literary works that were either unknown or at least, like the gorgeous poetry of the Golden Age of Spain, unfamiliar to Ashkenazi Jews. Though virtually all was written by men and focused on men, this early scholarship opened our eyes. It insisted that God's revelation manifests itself in every era, that it can be found not only in our ancient texts, but in the products of our own era, that it can encompass not only Jewish legal or agadic works from the rabbinic period, but also a wider range of Jewish literary output. And that it can not only inspire us, but can also demonstrate the breadth and diversity of our tradition and its ability to continue to nourish us. Our efforts to expand the canon in the last 50 years builds on these pioneering efforts. We too need to comb the past, and since we were asking different questions and had been impacted by different sensibilities, we discovered new things. Our initial questions focused on the missing half of the Jewish people, women. And lo and behold, when we began to look, we found that some of those Haskalah writers were women. Women who wrote memoirs, poems, stories, diaries, and essays. We unearthed so much material by extraordinary individuals that were previously unknown to us, or known only indirectly by obscure hints in the works of others. Because of the way scholars, publishers, archivists, and even ordinary people themselves had determined what was worthy, so much had been deemed insignificant, forgotten, or lost to history. My own scholarly trajectory is illustrative. When I decided to write a book about rabbis' wives, I was hoping to learn more about female Jewish leaders in the decades before women could become rabbis. So many people discouraged me. There are no sources. What will you write about? You won't find enough for a book. Wives were just helpmeets. There's nothing more to say. I learned to ignore these comments. But even when I'd interview rabbis' wives, some would themselves minimize what they had achieved. There's nothing important here, but you're welcome to look through the file cabinet where I store papers, simply because I don't like to throw anything away. I too had to find sources that were hidden or unknown, like Box 14. What was Box 14? A JTS archival listing from 1978 listed a 13-box collection of the papers of Herman Rabinowitz, rabbi of Temple Mishkan Tfilah in Boston, Massachusetts, from 1910 to 1947. But even though he and his wife Minyan worked together to build up their synagogue community and even published their memoirs in one joint volume entitled The Waking Heart, her papers were nowhere to be found in the JTS archives. When I began working on my book in the early 1990s, I kept badgering the JTS archivist because I had read enough to be convinced that Minyan Rabinowitz's papers must exist and had probably also been donated to JTS. A few years later, I got a call out of the blue. While cleaning out the JTS tower in preparation for its renovation, the archivist, Julie Miller, discovered Box 14, which was listed as Mrs. Rabinowitz Minyan. Letters, articles, memoirs, notes, reviews on her publications, etc. Somehow, this box had gotten separated from the collection, abandoned in an unused storage area. If my badgering hadn't alerted the archivist to be on the lookout, who knows if it would have ever been properly identified and reintegrated into the larger Rabinowitz collection. Research like this was the backbone of my full-length book, The Rabbi's Wife, which brings to light the achievements of so many women like Minyan Rabinowitz, whose roles in strengthening Jewish life had been under-acknowledged, but whose story is an essential part of our history, a story that had yet to be documented, cataloged, and told. I'm proud to know that every archive I visited when I was doing the research for my book now has a separate finding aid for the category Rebbitzins, rabbis' wives. This desire to redress the bias of the past has thankfully had a ripple effect beyond academia as well. Think of Overlooked, the women's obituary project initiated in March 2018 for the New York Times by Amisha Padnani and Jessica Bennett. They understood that while the newspaper of record had published thousands of obituaries since 1851, the vast majority chronicled the lives of men, mostly prominent white men. They decided to repair this historic inequity by soliciting nominations and then, at regular intervals, publishing obituaries for long-dead women that the newspaper had overlooked. Finally, they explained that from that moment on, the New York Times would adopt a more inclusive process to determine who merited memorialization in a New York Times obituary in the future. The feminist impulse has also had implications well beyond women's equality. By sensitizing us to the need to expand the canon, Jewish feminism opened our eyes to many other ways that our tradition could be enriched by including not only the voices of women, but those of other marginalized groups, Jews of color, differently abled Jews, LGBTQ Jews, and more. We realized that if we looked for marginalized Jews of all kinds in our texts and traditions, we would find them and draw meaning from their stories. We also understood that such explorations would lead some of us to write new responsa, to offer new midrashim, to create new rituals that would make these Jews visible and that might find a place in the canon of the future. The profound impact of this effort reminds us just how important it is for each and every one of us to engage with our canon and not to give up until we find ways to draw meaning from it, even if it requires us to expand it. Asking more of our tradition is not a sacrilege, but rather a sacred obligation. Only a tradition that is ever evolving in response to people's needs in every era will continue to replenish itself and flourish. And that is what we focus on in the way we educate our degree students at JTS and in how our faculty, alumni, and other community leaders engage us in learning as we are doing today. You are in for a treat as you study in smaller groups, exploring questions of canon and examining in more depth different ways of expanding it. May our sessions be nourishing and enlightening, and may we meet next face-to-face for more learning, hopefully soon.
We hope you enjoyed the keynote talk given by